Right, so to start this session, we have a short quote, long quote, short paragraph from one of our Insight Group members. And this person is sadly not able to join us today, but has really kindly given us a little bit of an insight into their experience of being autistic and what that looks like for them and why inclusive environments are important to them. So we asked our autistic member, how does being autistic impact you and how you interact with the world around them? And they said, everything outside my front door is potentially unuser friendly. It's ironic that I help other disabled people find solutions for navigating the public realm when I find strange textures like tactile paving makes my head tingle. Signage that does really say what it means and glass surfaces that have cross reflections distract me to the point where I might actually be in danger of being knocked over by a person or a vehicle. I actually got all the size of all the London Uniqlo decals changed on their display windows after colliding nose first into one thinking it was the entrance, a very painful way to make a meaningful change for everyone. I was invited to a newly refurbished town hall for a meeting. The address was clear, but there was no external signage to differentiate it from an almost identical building only a few doors away. When I finally found the only unlocked entrance, which was the sickening revolve door, I emerged into a minimalist reception room with no indication of which desk I should present myself at. It was 8:55 and my event was at 9:15. I knew there would be security procedures to go through, so I arrived early. I was waved away from all three computer terminals. Every attempt to speak was shut down. Please wait, someone will take your details soon. Down presently. No, can I help you? What do you need? Approach. I felt overlooked, dismissed, and when I announced I was autistic, getting very upset about the idea of being late, no adjustments were made. At 9 a.m. to 9:15, staff with key cards entered my path. Eventually, other members of my party arrived and intervened. We weren't given visitor passes, and couldn't access the lift without assistance. Needless to say, I've used this accessibility issue as part of my experience attending an equality diversity exchange meeting, and they have made useful changes based on some suggestions I made. A positive experience is that I'm currently the neurodiverse representative in the disabled residents team working on 80 million civic campus and LVHF, co-producing adaptations to wayfinding, branding, all toilet and public refreshment areas, co-working spaces, and major changes to a scary glass lift. My colleagues are inclusive architects, contractors, and consultants who've never met anyone as mouthy and opinionated as I am. The feedback, however, is great. The brainstorming is well received and I get paid. What more kudos do I need other than invite to cut the ribbon on it next year? Thank you very much for listening to that. That was from one of our Insight Group members sharing their experience. So without further ado, I'm just going to so our first speaker up is Kirsty Macmillan. And Kirsty is going to be talking about online safety experiences of autistic young people and interpretive phenomenological analysis. Right, I should have practiced the big words before we got going. Kirsty has helpfully recorded her talk, so hopefully this will work in just a second for you guys.
Hello, my name is Kirsty Macmillan and I am a PhD researcher at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. Today I'm going to talk about my PhD project, which focuses on the online safety experiences of autistic young people. In terms of structure, I will give an overview of the background, methods, results and conclusions to this study. In terms of trigger warnings, this talk will cover topics and lived experiences of cyberbullying and online sexual harassment. So please do not watch this talk right now if you think you may become distressed in any way. You will be able to watch it at another time when the conference recordings are available. Links to resources will be included towards the end of this talk, and I am happy to signpost to any other resources should you feel you need them. From the existing literature, we know that many autistic young people are active online users, with parents reporting them spending more time online than their non-autistic peers. Challenges in this population can include communication difficulties and focused interests. However, many autistic young people use social media and online gaming platforms for social connection and to share interests. Taking into account that autistic young people are prone to experiencing feelings of loneliness, this is really encouraging to hear. However, despite evidence that online platforms are beneficial to autistic people, researchers have suggested that autistic young people can have difficulty transitioning from online to offline contexts. Why is this relevant? Studies have reported a positive correlation between the time spent online and the likelihood of experiencing online security risks among non autistic children. On one hand, studies suggest that autistic adults are vulnerable to contact risks, i.e., where they participate in risky peer or personal communication, for example, cyberbullying or online sexual exploitation, whereas no significant differences in content risks, where they are a recipient of unwelcome or inappropriate mass communication, for example, phishing, have been reported between autistic adults and non autistic adults. From the few studies looking at autistic young people, these indicate that they are more susceptible to online conduct risks, where they act themselves to contribute to the risky contact or content. Therefore, autistic young people could be considered an at risk group for certain online safety issues. There are currently gaps in the existing research literature. The majority of previous studies have only investigated one type of online safety risk, for example, phishing, or have been predominantly conducted with autistic adults. So it is unclear to what extent these findings can be generalized to autistic young people. To the best of our knowledge, no published study has investigated autistic young people's online safety experiences. So the aim of this study was to explore how autistic young people communicated with others online versus face to face in offline contexts and their online safety experiences. We recruited 14 autistic young people aged 11 to 18 years, including 8 males and 6 females. The interviews took place pre pandemic, so these took place face to face, phone call, video call, and live web chat, depending on the participants' preferences. To help reduce any potential anxiety regarding what to expect in the interview, I emailed an outline of what would happen ahead of time to the participants to allow them time to process it or ask any questions. At the beginning of the interview, I asked them an introductory question about what they like to do in their spare time to help build up a rapport as well as help reduce any potential anxiety. Interview questions were designed to explore factors relating to autistic young people's online safety experiences. These were piloted with a young autistic adult and revised to ensure that they were readily understood and an appropriate length for autistic young people in this study. And these included questions such as, how do you find communicating with other people online? Can you please describe how you try to keep yourself safe online? And can you please describe what things would make going online better for you? All interview transcripts were analysed using interpretive phenomenological analysis, also known as IPA. With regards to autism research, there is a growing move away from the medical framework in which autistic people's experiences are judged from the outside. IPA encourages an exploration of societal factors that may impact on an individual's experiences. Given that autistic young people's online experiences are largely shaped by those factors, IPA was used in this study. Three superordinate and subsequent subordinate themes were extracted from the data. The first superordinate theme, impact of online activity, illustrates the impact of online on autistic young people's online experiences. The second, online risk management, refers to the strategies autistic young people perceived as keeping them safe online. The third, desire for solutions, encapsulates what autistic young people fed back would help to improve their online safety experiences. For the superordinate theme, impact of online activity, benefits and drawbacks of online communication were extracted as subthemes. On one hand, participants highlighted that online contexts allowed for the removal of direct eye contact and cameras off, which reduced pressure on social interactions compared with offline. For example, I quite like going online because it means I can talk to my friends without being pressured to make eye contact or look at them. On the other hand, participants reported that there were a lack of clues in online contexts, including physical reactions to help them understand what the other person was thinking. Sometimes it's harder to communicate what you mean because you haven't got that intonation in what you say online. This could lead to challenges when autistic young people felt that they had been misinterpreted by others online. I think sometimes you can say something and you do not know the adverse reaction that some people are going to have to it, and they will pile onto you, and you will just be left in the dark. Two gender-specific subthemes were extracted from the data. For males, 3 out of the 8 participants reported challenges with inhibiting online responses. One participant highlighted that online context enabled him to make faster decisions, which could lead to consequences in the future. It's kind of down to the technology because it allows you to make split-second decisions that you wouldn't make otherwise. It is a lot easier to send a text with an unsavory photograph than it is to save it, print it off, and put it in a letter because you have that process where you have time to think about if you are going to do it, whereas online it is very easy to send it as you think and you instantly regret it. Half of the autistic females in our sample reported having experienced unwanted online sexual harassment. One participant noted that it could be challenging to handle these unwanted online interactions without worrying about coming across as unfriendly. Sometimes people kind of draw you in and they will start talking to you, and all of a sudden it turns sexual and it's really uncomfortable because you have started talking to this person that you enjoy talking with, and then all of a sudden, they're like, let's make it about sex. And you're like, whoa, it's too much. I don't like it. And you're really uncomfortable because you want to be polite, but you don't want to be in that situation anymore. In terms of online risk management, all of the participants in our sample reported avoiding online contact with others as a means to keeping themselves safe online. Some emphasized not sharing personal information online, not sharing your email password, not sharing where you live. Don't trust anyone because you don't know them, because you could be sharing information with anyone. 12 out of our 14 participants reported a form of parental involvement in their online risk management. My family has done quite a few things to help me stay safe, but I can't remember exactly what. My mummy installed something on my phone that tells her what I'm looking at. It's noteworthy that for some participants, checking for visual clues helped them to detect potentially unsafe websites. For example, usually if you don't have the padlock thing, you don't put any details in. Desire for practical solutions was extracted with 2 subthemes. This included the requirement for contemporary training in schools. Participants reported a lack of up-to-date online safety awareness. One noted that he saw the same online safety video each year. Every year, just like any other, the school shows the same online safety video over and over and over again. Don't share anything like your password or information. Make sure you have a stable account, blah, blah, blah. In terms of future solutions, 5 out of 14 participants fed back that they would like more practical support to block unwanted online contacts. One participant noted that support to manage message requests would be beneficial to avoid engaging in unwanted contact. It would be useful to know what to do if someone message requests you so you don't answer them, because some people will and will end up having long conversations with them. Our results raise some key points. On one hand, online context can be useful for autistic young people with regards to the removal of eye contact and increased processing time. However, a lack of physical clues associated with them may increase the likelihood of miscommunications occurring between autistic young people and others online, also known as the double empathy problem, which may make them more vulnerable to experiencing contact risks. For autistic young males, it is possible that special interest may put them at an increased risk of spear phishing attempts. Moreover, elevated camouflaging among autistic young females may increase their vulnerability to online sexual harassment. In terms of online risk management, autistic young people may want more online interaction, but are wary of unwanted contact. Our findings highlight that parents act as an additional protective barrier in their child's online risk management. Moreover, visual search strategies can help protect some autistic young people from content risks. Our results indicate that keeping up to date regarding online safety developments for educators is challenging, so this needs to be addressed in the future. It is likely that digital tools that support autistic young people to block unwanted contacts will allow them more online independence. Therefore, it is important that autistic young people are consulted and involved in the design of future online safety interventions. Overall, our findings highlight that autistic young people are at risk pertaining to certain online safety risks. Based on our results, more research is warranted regarding gender differences in contact and conduct risks. Designers should examine the potential benefits of adding visual cues to support autistic young people's online risk management. And future tools will be more readily accepted if they are co-designed with autistic young people. If you or anyone you know have been affected by any of the issues raised in this talk, please see the contact links in this slides for the NSPCC and Childline. Before I finish, I would like to thank my supervisory team. I'm very grateful to my supervisors, Dr. Tessa Berg, Dr. Mike Just, and to Dr. Mary Stewart as well for their ongoing patience, expertise, and support throughout my PhD. Above all, I would like to thank all of the autistic young people and their parents who have taken part in my research, without whom it just wouldn't exist. If you would like to contact me, you can email me at km32@hw.ac.uk, or you can contact me via Twitter. My handle is @kh_Macmillan. Thank you very much for listening to me today.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. And Kirsty is here with us, so please do ask her questions using the Q&A button, and she'll be joining us for the Q&A section. So our next speaker is Emma, and Emma will be talking about exploring the experience of autistic play.
I'm really pleased to be speaking today. I'd like to thank Autistica for inviting me. So I'm going to be talking about a work in progress on exploring the experience of autistic play, an interpretative phenomenological analysis. And that's really hard to say, so I'm pleased I got that. So I'm a PhD student based at the Play and Communication Lab at the Peddle Centre at the University of Cambridge. While I'm here, I'd like to highlight my source of funding. So I'm funded by the Lego Foundation. And as a content warning, I'd just like to say that I do talk about the medical model and how it views autism as like a disease. So if that's distressing to anyone, I recommend engaging in some self-care. So firstly, I'd like to highlight the team involved in the project, just to show that it's by no means an individual effort, and there's other people who have been heavily involved. So there's Dr. Jenny Gibson, who is my supervisor, and then Carmen De Lemos and Dr. Katie Howard. Firstly, I'd like to introduce the wider background to the project in terms of what play is and why we should study play. So play is really difficult to define, and it often has different meanings for different people. But one way it can be defined is that it's activities or behaviours that are non-literal, voluntary, and it's fun or rewarding. So by non-literal, I mean that it often involves some form of pretense or imaginary play. And then people also play just for its own sake. It takes on different forms, such as solitary play by oneself, social play with other people, pretend or imaginary play, and digital play, such as video gaming. And play is so important to research because it's so commonplace in childhood, and it's also really important for different aspects of development, such as the development of communication and social skills, an ability to cope, for relaxation, and to explore the environment. In terms of the more specific rationale or motivations behind this study in particular, we noted that often in the literature and in assessment or intervention contexts, autistic play is often described as solitary or deficient. So it's described in a very negative or deficit-focused way. So for example, autistic people, especially children, are described as lacking in social play or imaginary play, and also their play is characterised by the presence of restricted or so-called restricted or repetitive behaviours, and these are also framed in a negative way. And this is linked really closely to the medical model of disability, in which autism is viewed as a disease. As well as being characterised by deficits, there's a focus on curing or normalising autism. And this often involves a reliance on observing or interpreting autistic behaviours in line with neurotypical norms. In recent years, there's been a rise in neurodiversity paradigm, which has raised several key criticisms of the medical model and its deficit focus. For example, the deficit focus provides an incomplete view of autism, Several advocates of neurodiversity argue that both the strengths and difficulties that autistic people may show are central to autistic identity. Therefore, focusing on the deficits presents an unbalanced and incomplete view of autism. Important here are the negative effects of this on autistic people. For example, the negative language use could be seen as a form of ableism, or it's discriminatory, and this relates to stigma and marginalisation of autistic people. It also may have an impact on autistic people's well-being and mental health. And relating to this criticism is a lack of consideration of autistic perspectives, both in terms of what and how research gets done, which is often termed as participatory research, and also in terms of looking at autistic views relating to different topics. Promisingly, there has been a shift in the wider autism literature that is helping us to reframe autism and how it's viewed away from this deficit focus and instead towards a more balanced perspective. So there's more research on autistic strengths. There's more research using participatory design and talking about its importance. And there's more research looking at autistic perspectives on different topics. So I don't have time to talk through them all, but I thought I'd just select one example. So for example, the so-called restricted and repetitive behaviours have been reframed as stims or stimming behaviours, which serve adaptive functions such as helping one to cope with their emotions. Now, although this is really promising, we noticed that this hasn't really been explored in terms of autistic play. And so we wanted to conduct a study of autistic play from an autistic perspective in order to contribute to this literature in a more positive way. And reinforcing this, we conducted the stakeholder consultation via the Autistica network and for informal contacts involving both autistic people and other members of the autism community, such as practitioners like speech and language therapists or teachers. And there was a general consensus of both of the importance of both play and play-based interventions as important topics. Most important to the study I'm talking about today is the importance of understanding autistic play from an autistic perspective. And this consultation also informed a separate review of play-based interventions for autistic children that has just been published, and I think the link for that will be shared in the chat. So as I said, we want to explore autistic play from an autistic perspective, and we had 3 aims relating to this. So the first one focuses on experiences and meaning of play. The second one focuses on differences and similarities of autistic play to non-autistic or neurotypical play. And then there are experiences of profiles and assessments incorporating play. So we conducted semi-structured interviews with 22 autistic adults aged between 18 and 57 who'd either received a professional diagnosis or were self-diagnosed. And we asked questions related to the aims that I just mentioned. So in terms of experience of play, we asked what sort of activities they like to do, the purposes that play serves, motivations behind this, if it's beneficial. And we also asked about this idea called flow, which is a bit like hyperfocus. And we, in terms of comparing their play to other people's play, as well as similarities and differences, we asked autistic people about whether they think autistic play is fully understood in society, and also about stereotypes and whether they think they are accurate. And then finally, we asked about experience of assessment and intervention using play. And a really, really important part of this was to conduct a consultation to make sure that the interview procedures and design were as suitable as possible and accommodating to each person's preferences. So for example, we either conducted the interviews in a written format, such as via email, or a verbal format, like Zoom or phone, just to make sure that we were, I suppose, accommodating to each person's preferences, and we see that as a really important part of research. So as I said at the beginning, it's a work in progress. So what I can do is highlight where I am now. I'm at the analysis stage, and it's in its very early stages. So what I can do is just tell you about the form of analysis, and then I've got a couple of quotations that I've picked out. So I'm using interpretative phenomenological analysis, which focuses on understanding the lived experiences of people. So in this case, the autistic people, and that's completely in line with the aims of the project. And so it's very important. So I said I'd talk about a couple of example quotations that I think are interesting. So the first quotation here: "I think often my play is quite repetitive, and it's a way of soothing if it's a solitary experience, solitary play." So here we can see that their solitary play is repetitive, and importantly, this has a positive function for the person. They find it soothing. And this really reminds me of the research I mentioned earlier about the positive aspects of stimming. And so this reinforces that. And it shows that, often these behaviours are framed as restricted and repetitive behaviours, and they're framed as being unusual or harmful, but here we can see that's clearly not the case. Then the second quotation: "If it's a group setting, then I prefer like board games or something that has a structure to it, like that, where there's more certainty." So here you can see, contrary to stereotypes, the person likes to engage in social play. And also here you can see a link between structure and certainty, which is clearly important to the person. In terms of future directions, of course, I need to finish the analysis. And the really important part of this is to allow participants to give feedback on the findings of the project. And in that way, we can make sure that we are highlighting the autistic perspectives, which is the whole point of the study, really. So as I said earlier, this will highlight, we hope to contribute to the wider literature that is helping reframe our understanding of autism away from this deficit focus and towards a more balanced understanding of autism. And importantly, this may have implications for future practice, for example, in terms of how play may be included in assessments or interventions in a much more positive way in the future. Okay, so I'd just like to finish with a thank you, really, for listening to my presentation. I'm happy to be contacted in the ways on the slide, and there's links to more information that I think are being posted in the chat. Right, so I will just finish there. Lovely, great. I have no idea how to.
If you wiggle the mouse, there should be like a red stop sharing button come up. Don't worry if not, I might be able to override from my end.
I can pause it, but I couldn't stop it. Okay, lovely, thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk, Emma. Really interesting. And don't forget to ask questions for Emma, and we'll go for those shortly. Right, sharing screen is back onto me now. So let's see if I share screen too. And then...
Hi guys, my name is Kirsty McAuliffe, and today I'm going to be presenting the results of my MSc dissertation research, the title of which is "My Whole Life Has Been a Process of Finding Labels That Fit, a thematic analysis of autistic LGBTQIA+ identity and inclusion in the LGBTQIA+ community." This research was conducted with the help of my supervisor, Dr. Ailey Cage, and soon-to-be Dr. Rubes J. Walsh, who acted as an autistic consultant on the project. As some of you may know, autistic people are more likely to be non-heterosexual and non-cisgender, with many identifying as bisexual or non-binary, for example. Much of the research on this population focuses on the intersection of autistic and trans identities, with many seeking to discover the causes of this so-called overrepresentation, which is a perspective that I find quite pathologizing. Very few studies consider the potential benefits this intersection of identities could confer. For example, access to increased social support via the autistic and LGBTQIA+ community. So the aims for my study were to examine how autistic LGBTQIA+ individuals experience and understand their multiple minoritized identities. I also wanted to look at whether these identities impacted their opportunities for community participation. In particular, in terms of this, I focused on the LGBTQIA+ community. I chose to do a qualitative study due to the nature of the subject matter, which deals with personal experiences. In line with this, some of the experiences reported by participants are quite invalidating, and language has been included in the quotes, which reflects this. So if you don't feel like hearing about that today, feel free to take a break. So in order to achieve these aims, I recruited 12 participants via social media. The inclusion criteria were as follows. Participants had to be over the age of 18. They had to have a score of over 14 on the RADS, a measure of autistic traits, and/or a formal autism diagnosis. They had to be able to read, write, and speak English, and they also had to live in the UK because we wanted to know about the community here. As you can see from this table, multiple identity intersections were represented in the final sample. The average age of participants was 34, with ages ranging from 24 to 53. In terms of gender, 3 participants were men, 4 were women, 3 were non-binary, and 2 were agender. In terms of sexuality, 2 participants were gay, 1 was lesbian, 5 were bi, 3 were queer, and 1 was asexual. And in terms of diagnosis, 3 participants were self-diagnosed and 9 were formally diagnosed. In order to understand the experiences of participants, I co-developed a semi-structured interview schedule, which is basically like a list of topics, with Rubes J. Walsh, who, as I mentioned, was an autistic consultant on the study. We asked questions such as, what does community mean to you? What communities do you feel part of? And in what ways do you experience the LGBTQIA+ community, for example? Multiple communication methods were used for the interviews, including phone call, video call, and instant messaging on Skype. Most participants opted for a video call, the average length of which was 44 minutes. The transcripts from the interviews were analysed using thematic analysis, which basically involves looking for patterns of meaning in the dataset or commonalities in what the participants have said. The final themes and sub-themes that we came up with can be seen here. There is quite a lot in this diagram, so I'll go through each theme individually. The first theme was identity redevelopment. This theme captured how participants learned about their identities and developed confidence in how they identify. This theme consists of 5 sub-themes. The first 2 relate to an awareness that participants had, often from an early age, that they were different, although they sometimes lacked the knowledge or frameworks to articulate how or why. The second sub-theme in particular highlighted how a lack of representation impacted upon the identity development of participants. This was the case both in terms of their autistic and LGBTQIA+ identities. As Rowan stated, lack of representation definitely made it more difficult. Queer people tend to be represented in specific ways, which may not align with who I am, so I just didn't think it was a possibility. The third sub-theme relates to the manner in which engaging in community spaces provided participants with knowledge and frameworks that helped them understand their identity. This provided participants with an opportunity to understand their identity outside of a medicalized discourse, which often focused on deficit. As Drew stated, things that are written by people with that experience make a lot more sense than anything that's written by authority figures. The final 2 sub-themes relate to an increased comfort experienced by participants in terms of their identity, which they achieved through communicating with trusted others and the feeling that their identity made sense in terms of their previous life experiences. The second theme, navigating authenticity, relates to how participants negotiated their identities and their interactions with the world around them. Participants reported being more understanding and compassionate towards themselves following their understanding of their identities. Experiencing a sense of belonging in a community of similar others was considered to be essential to this process of self-acceptance. Participants described the experience of being themselves in certain contexts as, and I quote, "comfortable and natural, just normal, I guess. It just feels like home." And the sense of being in a group where you can flop about in your pajamas. This contrasted with the experiences of participants navigating the wider environment. As Caleb stated, I've had more adverse reactions to telling people I'm autistic than I have telling people I was gay. This meant that participants had to develop strategies such as masking or concealing their identities, in order to navigate the wider environment. This highlights the importance of community settings as spaces where participants could be more authentically themselves. Despite the importance of accessing community spaces, participants reported being multiply excluded from them. Several aspects of this exclusion had to do with the types of spaces which abound for LGBTQIA+ people, such as bars and clubs. The commercialization of community space in this way involves a multitude of barriers which aren't specific to autistic people, such as financial barriers, age restrictions, and the concentration of community spaces in urban areas. Some specific aspects of exclusion were faced by autistic people, including the intersection of sensory and social difficulties. Participants highlighted in particular that the unstructured nature of the social environment was difficult as it was designed around a neuronormative standard of relating. As both stated, even though it was clearly an environment that was designed with the explicit intention of people getting to know people, it was not an environment in which that felt possible to me. Participants also discussed how the strategies they used to deal with the sensory overload, such as going outside to take a break, were often socially stigmatized. Exclusion also occurred in relation to the gatekeeping processes which defined who belonged in these spaces. This was reported by participants who were bi and attended gay bars with an opposite-sex partner, for example. This was also evident in terms of the societal discourse concerning the intersection of autistic and LGBTQIA+ identities. As Marianne referenced, there's a stereotype you're not really queer, it's just that your brain is wired a bit weirdly. Despite the problems which persist in the LGBTQIA+ community, many participants were motivated to engage in it and to contribute to community activism. This activism took various forms, with some participants organizing community groups, and others recognizing that even acknowledging your identity in an unwelcoming context is a radical act which changes things for those who follow you. Participants were also motivated to change the acceptance and equality of autistic people in society, and highlighted how this struggle for equality mirrored the process that the LGBTQIA+ community had gone through to an extent. As Ben highlighted, society hasn't yet reached that point of acceptance and equality for autistic people, even if awareness has improved. Participants often emphasized how their own agency as autistic people was often underestimated. As Drew stated, for a lot of years we've had things organized for us, often by people who think we're less capable than we are. This sense of agency also came to the fore as participants created alternatives, often when community spaces were inaccessible, and they ensured that they and similar others could access them. Before I go on to the conclusion, I do want to mention some limitations associated with the study. The first thing that's important to acknowledge is that the LGBTQIA+ and autistic communities are not monolithic, and this study was limited in terms of its capacity to describe both in detail. This is particularly due to my own positionality as a non-autistic member of the LGBTQIA+ community. Additionally, this study was qualitative. The results are naturally not generalizable to all autistic LGBTQIA+ individuals. The study had a severe lack of ethnic diversity. All of the participants were white, so future research should endeavour to examine the impact of having a minority ethnic identity on factors such as community participation. None of the participants disclosed a co-occurring learning disability, and so future studies should also endeavour to include multiply disabled people, including examining how other forms of neurodiversity impacts opportunities for community participation. This study suggests that, similar to other minoritized groups, autistic LGBTQIA+ individuals are motivated to engage in communities relevant to their identities, and that these communities can provide access to a sense of belonging, self-knowledge, and self-acceptance. However, LGBTQIA+ community spaces are often inaccessible to autistic people due to sensory, social, and identity-based barriers, such as gatekeeping. In particular, autism understanding was highlighted as a barrier to coming out in both community and non-community settings. This suggests that we really need to work on improving autism understanding and acceptance in order to facilitate the creation of intersectional, accessible, and inclusive community spaces. Additionally, we should support autistic LGBTQIA+ individuals to develop their own spaces in which they can be authentically themselves. So this is just some references that I've included, and I would like to say thank you very much to Roops J. Watt, Ayla Cage, and to all of my participants, and to you all for listening. I look forward to your questions.
I was on mute. It's all going well today. Thank you, Christine. That was brilliant. So now we've got the Q&A for Kirsty, Emma, and Christine. So if you can turn your cameras on and join me. Brilliant. Thank you, guys. So I'm going to start it off by asking a question that we've asked kind of throughout the festival. And that is just kind of how did you end up studying this area of research? What led you to it? And Kirsty, you're top of my screen, so I'm going to go with you first.
Thanks, Bethan. So my brother is autistic, and when I was in school, I started volunteering at charities that supported autistic children and young people, hoping that maybe I could help in some way. However, as the years have gone on, they have and continue to teach me so much more about autism than before that I'd ever learned in books before. And from that really inspired me to pursue autism research. And I did that in my undergraduate degree in psychology, my master's, and now my PhD. I specifically got interested in my PhD because, as I've mentioned today and we've talked about throughout the conference, and having online spaces is so important to so many autistic people. And I'd always been quite interested in why there hadn't been many studies looking at this potentially really big barrier of like online security and safety risks before. And that's what got me into this.
Thank you, Kirsty. Emma, what about you?
So for me, I guess I really resonate with the with the rationale slide that I gave on the presentation. So to me, I think it's really important that we should be highlighting strengths that autistic people have, and also I'm really interested in behind all this like participatory research and the importance of involvement. And also I've seen like a lot of things about the deficit focus on social media, and I think it's quite shocking sometimes what I read. So and as a person, I'd want to help people. So I feel like through looking at strengths and things like that, hopefully that can have a positive impact on autistic people, and importantly in a way that's meaningful for them. So I actually have a clinical psychology background in terms of my like undergraduate and master's degree. And it was quite shocking actually how they talked about autism in a really deficit way. And that's kind of incorporated within lectures and stuff, so like that. And I think that's a real issue and needs to be changed. I don't know if it has changed since I've been, but yeah. And then of course, because of my interest in this area, that's also part of my PhD. So what I've been talking about today is one of the studies of the PhD, and then I also want to look at hopefully look at the role of autistic play in autism diagnostic assessment and how we can reframe that in a more strength-based way. So yeah,
that sounds really interesting.
Thanks.
I love all the focus on strengths over other things. Christine, what about you?
Yeah, I think similar to what Emma was saying, when I first started studying autism, it was in my undergraduate degree, and I was looking at autism and interoception. And it similarly just seemed like every time, no matter what the autistic participants did, it was always a deficit. Like even if they were better at the task, it was like a deficit in being better. And so I think that just kind of motivated me, like seeing the sort of dehumanization and the sort of stigma against autistic people. I was like, okay, there's obviously something to be done here. And then in terms of my master's dissertation, I think, as I mentioned, kind of as a member of the LGBT community, I was sort of familiar with this experience of marginalization in a different context and the importance of kind of accessing similar others and seeing representation and stuff. So yeah, I guess that's how I came to that particular project.
Brilliant, thank you so much. So Kirsty, a question specifically for you, and it's about your methodology. So did you look at any kind of specific forms of social media in the project, or just kind of online communication as a whole? And consequently, was there any discussion about kind of what sites specifically can do to improve their platform or user experience for autistic users?
Yes, there was. So we looked at online communication as a whole, and we did that because I didn't want to potentially limit what any of the participants in our study experience was. So if we'd maybe only just kept it and asked specifically about social media sites, then if they didn't use them, but they use something else, then whether that be email, etc., then that would limit what they could tell us. So we kept it very general to online communication and how did they find communicating online. And but social media sites did come up quite frequently in the participants' feedback. In terms of what they fed back in terms of what sites could do to help improve their online experiences. Some reported back that for social media sites, specifically like Instagram, they reported back that they would like it if the report function, whether that maybe be for content or communication that they did not want, or if that was harassment, worked. So that makes that has implications, especially as many people who've been watching the news this week, and social media sites need to do more to pick up abuse online and do that well. And others fed back that in terms of how information is presented, they would find it more useful if there were visual cues rather than say lots and lots and lots of text. And yes, these were things that specifically came up within our sample. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Emma, a question for you. So this is about kind of your sample, I guess. And there's, I'll combo 2 questions. I just warn you, I'll try and do this. So firstly, looking at kind of who was involved and who wasn't involved in your sample. So did you kind of work with any non-verbal children? Was there reasoning about it? Or things like gender, was that kind of a factor in your participants at all?
So we didn't include any children at all, but we intended to do another study with children, but basically COVID got in the way. And so they're all adults. So in terms of the interviews, they had to have, I guess, the ability to partake in an interview either online in the verbal format or in the written way. So I suspect that it was not the case that they were minimally or verbal, however, I can't remember the most appropriate way to say it at the moment. Then in terms of gender, I believe that there's a mix of males and females, and a non-binary as well. Was that all the question I covered, or is there another part?
Yeah, I mean, did you notice any kind of difference between genders or those assigned male and female genders at birth? Was that something that came up at all in your research?
We didn't specifically set up to look at that. I mean, so far I haven't really noticed anything to do with that, but it would be interesting to see if anything comes out like that as I continue analysing the data.
Thank you. Christine, a question for you. What was kind of the reflection that struck you or stayed with you the most kind of from your participants? So many of them kind of resonate really strongly with autistic LGBTQIA+ experiences. What stood out most for you?
That's such a nice question. Yeah, I think one of the things that stood out the most for me, I love the quote about being in your pajamas and, not having to kind of perform and sort of tidy yourself up in that way. But yeah, I think also the sort of the way participants just discussed, the difference between being autistic and being LGBT and how being autistic sort of made them a target in a way that being LGBT didn't necessarily. In particular, there's so many, I could talk forever, but in particular, one participant said that being autistic now was kind of a throwback to being LGBT in the 90s, when the kind of deficit, basically the deficit model of understanding sexuality and gender was like so prominent then. So yeah, I think that was kind of very interesting to me in terms of the historical progress of both kind of communities. Yeah, but there's so many. Hard to pick.
Really interesting, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a question that's come up before this week, that comparison between LBGT experiences and autistic experiences going through the past. It's quite an interesting area. So I've got a question for all of you. So this question is focused on universities, but I do think we could explore it out. But they are interested in your opinions on kind of how universities, or as I say, other similar spaces, can create more welcoming spaces for autistic people, especially kind of focusing on the strength barriers, which obviously all of your guys' work kind of very strength focused. How could that be brought forward into actually making space different for people? Kirsty, I'm going to go back up to you first.
That's a great question. I think above all, I think what is a really good starting base is when people are trying to think about how can we make spaces as a whole, including universities, more accessible for autistic people. It's key that feedback and consultation is sought with autistic people. Something is not going to work well if something is designed without their involvement, because only they will know what will truly work and what doesn't work for them. I think some of the things that I know have come up in the past would be noise levels. For some busy lecture theatres, that can be incredibly overwhelming for an autistic person who has got sensory issues. And so some people have fed back from in the midst of the pandemic that having online lectures was actually much more accessible for them. So I think options for keeping lectures or tutorials online should be discussed. And also, I think that one thing that can come up is issues with group work. Like a lot of universities will place quite a lot of emphasis on group work for modules, but there won't be much guidance or support. So some autistic students are left in situations where they're not quite sure how to get support for those situations. And then they might be put in groups where they can have challenges and there can be miscommunications with non-autistic people. So I think that there's so much to be done. It'd be great to hear what Christine and Emma think about this, but above all, ask autistic people what they would find useful.
Brilliant, that is an excellent message to put out there. Emma, what about you? What do you think?
I mean, I completely echo what Kirsty is saying about actually asking autistic people what they think. I think that's really important. I also wonder whether maybe there needs to be some sort of input at like the higher level within universities. So those who are higher up, not sure exactly what sort of roles, but if we can try and convince those who are higher up, I mean, that might then help make changes on the lower levels to make things more inclusive. And I'm not sure if I've explained that very well, but yeah.
That's great. I think it is, meaningful involvement and that kind of thing. It's not just at the start. What about you, Christine?
Yeah, I definitely echo everything that's been said as well. And I think my supervisor has done some work on this, subtle plug of her work. Yeah, that's Ailey Cage. And I think what she found was specifically to do with the kind of transition to uni and how that can be such a huge change. And often there isn't actually that much support. Like you just kind of get there and you're suddenly responsible for organizing everything and, doing a million different things in a very kind of self-directed way. So yeah, specifically support around that. And yeah, I agree that I have heard that online lectures are super helpful, including people
can watch them kind of like at speed and, you know, just pick and choose kind of what they need to revise. Yeah, I also work as a university mentor for autistic people. So I think another thing is that just giving really detailed instructions and not interpreting questions as necessarily, you know, in a defensive way. Sometimes people want to know why they have to do a particular thing. So just being able to explain that can be really helpful. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. I'll ask you another question. I've got a bit more time. So, Kirsty, a question for you. Could the findings of your research be used to inform kind of the development of safety resources for autistic children, young people, their parents? And this person says they kind of know of some out there, but they tend to be much more focused on parent consultation rather than actual research evidence with the children, with wider groups. What do you think?
Another great question. Yes, I really hope that the findings from my PhD, now I'm like by the end of this, I will have barely scratched the surface, and I really, really hope that more and more people do research in this area and to help improve the online safety experiences of autistic young people. But like I hope that from what we find throughout this project that we can offer recommendations to autistic young people, families, and we hope that will filter out to other areas as well, such as areas where practitioners are involved and policy as well. There's a lack of policy, I think, out there as well regarding what supports there are for the autistic community. And I agree, there are some resources out there, but as like the person who asked the question highlighted, they've been very focused, as a lot of research has been on the past on parental input, which I'm not saying is not useful in any way. However, there's the input and the findings that I had from working with autistic young people in this study, I would not have been able to get from a parental survey. And sometimes it's difficult for parents to always catch all of the online safety risks that their child may experience. So I hope that that if we're able to involve autistic young people more in the future, then we're going to create better tools and resources to help them stay on independent online as much as possible.
Brilliant, thank you. Emma, so hopefully this question makes sense to you, I'm not sure. So what, if any, were your findings that related autistic play to our predominant learning style of forming connections and pattern making?
That's a good question. So obviously I did say that I haven't really finished analysing the data yet. But what I guess I can answer in terms of things I've noticed so far. So I'm not sure about that per se, but I definitely remember some people talking about like attention to detail and things like hyperfocus, and I guess they can do that with some play activities, like with video games, and then that could translate over to, for example, in a job setting. So it could really help them with work. So I think that I found that quite interesting. I remember someone also mentioned something else about like problem solving. And how they quite liked playing video games, and then they felt like, oh, okay, now I can solve my problems more effectively because of the sort of games that they played. But I'm not sure in terms of those learning styles that you mentioned, but that would be interesting to look at.
I think that's the thing we find with researchers, you can keep going forever, can't you, as much as possible. And Christine, a final question for you before we move on to our break. So obviously autistic people, LGBT people are quite vulnerable with COVID kind of along. I mean, did you do your research during COVID, or did you think it would have made much difference if you hadn't had, depending on when you did do it? What kind of role do you think that played in?
Yeah, the interviews were between May and June 2020, so kind of, very much in the midst of it. And I think particularly at that time, people were, keenly feeling the absence of community in their lives. I think it also was intersected quite interestingly with this whole issue of online accessibility that we were kind of talking about. And so some participants said that, you know, having online community events was actually more accessible for them, and that they would never have been able to go before. And sometimes this was due to kind of the environment, or sometimes it was due to them living in a rural location, and if they wanted to go to an event, they'd have to travel, 5 hours altogether, and it just didn't make sense. So I think, yeah, it's a very, very interesting time in terms of like increased accessibility, but also increased isolation in that sense. Yeah. It's hard to disentangle like the full impact, because we're still in it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Kirsty, Emma and Christine. That was absolutely brilliant. So we're going to have a break now, and we'll start again at 15:15 for our final 3 speakers. Thank you guys so much. Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you all had a chance to move about in the break. So our next speaker up is Ketan Parmar, who will be talking about autism and eye examination accessibility. So Ketan, if you're able to share your slides. Brilliant.
Hello everyone, my name's Ketan Parmar and I'm a fully qualified optometrist as well as PhD student at the University of Manchester. My project is investigating possible links between autism and visual conditions, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about a study in which we looked at autism and eye examination accessibility. Why is this area important though? Well, significant issues surround healthcare provision to the autistic population. A survey conducted by the Westminster Commission on Autism in 2016 found 74% of their autistic, parent advocate and professional respondents felt that the autistic population receives poorer healthcare. Research has shown that autistic adults are more likely to report unmet medical needs and attend A&E, visit their GP or be admitted to hospital, suggesting that they may be missing out on the health and care pathways which have been set up in recent years in community. Looking at it from the professional's point of view, GPs have reported low confidence in managing their autistic patients. Although studies have explored the general healthcare access barriers for autistic people, none of this has touched on anything to do with optometric services. Obviously, there's key differences between optometric practice and other healthcare divisions. Like in optometric practice, you have a retail environment combined with a clinical environment in the high street. You see a number of staff members when you attend, and there's a multitude of tests involved in the eye examination. So keeping all this in mind and considering the possible unique barriers to accessing eye care services, we wanted to investigate the eye examination experiences of autistic adults without learning disabilities. For this, we took a qualitative approach. We conducted a total of 4 focus groups with 18 autistic adults without learning disabilities, 6 of which were female at birth, and the age range across the group was 25 to 67 years. Amongst the participants, we had glasses wearers, contact lens wearers, and there was various eye histories, traumas, treatments, surgeries, and conditions. So the discussions were about our participants' eye examination experiences in the past, and we audio recorded these so that we could transcribe them to thematically analyse them. Thematical analysis allowed us to bring out what the key thoughts and opinions of our participants were on this matter. And through this process, we allocated 4 key themes to the discussions, which we're now going to look at in a bit more detail over the next few slides. The first area of discussion was practice operation and how that influenced accessibility. Now, amongst the participants, it was clear that there was a certain level of anxiety associated with attending for an eye examination. But nevertheless, they weren't ever asked about their accessibility or special requirements when they went for an eye examination. So they couldn't say in advance what advantages or challenges they may face when they go for an eye examination. Our participants appreciated that different practices have different approaches to the way the practices lay out or the decoration, but any sudden changes in layout or decoration could be unsettling for our participants because all of a sudden they'd been in an environment which they weren't comfortable with or familiar with. Sensory issues could be provoked by some aspects of optometric practices, like the lighting, the colours of walls, the patterns formed by carpets, the number of people moving around in the practice, or the noise levels. It's typical of larger practices to arrange their patient visits into what we call patient journeys. That's where different staff members look after different parts of the optometric visit and usually in different parts of the practice. But this wasn't really taken to by our participants because our participants made clear that it took them time to get comfortable around and used to a new person. And that was the same for a different environment. And therefore, having to go through a process like this was quite uncomfortable. Finally, there was an interesting discussion about alternative methods to booking appointments. Now, the mainstay, as we'll know, is to book an appointment over the phone. But many of our participants didn't like speaking on the phone to strangers, and they'd avoid this. Many of our participants had a backlog of appointments as a result, and their family members who were dependent on them did too. So if there was the opportunity to book online, which some practices offer, or by email, this would actually facilitate booking an appointment and attending a regular eye examination. The participants discussed some eye examination specific considerations, so things that happen in the testing room itself. Firstly, they made it clear that there needs to be an improvement in the level of communication on the part of the optometrist. It's essential that they keep the autistic patient well informed about what test is being conducted, why it's being conducted, what equipment will be used, and what exactly the patient needs to do. Similarly, it's really important that all of the patients presenting queries are clearly answered so that an autistic person can go away knowing that they've had a thorough examination and they can feel stress-free that their queries have been looked into. So these minor increases in the level of detail given by the practitioner can greatly reduce the anxiety of an autistic person and just reduce the fear of the unknown of what's going to happen next. There were some test-specific concerns that were also mentioned. So although our participants enjoyed the structure and the gadgets involved in an eye examination, some tests, such as the air puff test to check eye pressure, or checking the eye health with a handheld microscope, which requires quite close proximity, could cause a sudden spike in anxiety. Or there could be a sudden spike in sensory experiences because of some tests like those involving bright lights. The patient-practitioner relationship, or this interpersonal interaction between the two, was said to greatly outweigh anything else that would happen in the testing room or during the visit. So if this was nailed, then the rest of the examination would flow a lot more smoothly and comfortably for the autistic participant. This could be achieved by establishing a good rapport on the part of the optometrist. So that can be done by being friendly, introducing themselves, surprisingly that's not always done, reassuring the patient, making sure they're listening, and also being attentive to the challenges and the advantages that an autistic patient may have during the examination. Practitioner continuity across visits was important for our participants. I've already mentioned that the participants said that it took them time to become comfortable and used to a new person. And therefore, if they saw a familiar face at each of their eye examination visits year after year, this would instantly make them feel a lot more comfortable. They'd probably impart a lot more information and just be a bit more forthcoming. It wasn't that they didn't feel that a different practitioner wasn't competent, but they didn't feel that they could trust them as much. The final theme was about preparing the patient for their visit. Now, the participants said that just because they wore glasses, which the majority of them didn't mean that they didn't need to know what was going to happen or what to expect. Knowing what to expect for our participants meant that they'd be less anxious when they attended for their eye examination, and this would mean that they'd have more capacity to deal with other things. So we could achieve this by when the autistic patient attends for their visit, before anything happens, just sitting down with them and explaining what procedures are going to happen during the visit, or sending them some information in advance, descriptions, pictures, videos of the different procedures that will take place, or finally allowing them to visit in advance of their examination date to see the practice, see the staff members, maybe look at the equipment too. So just offering these different alternatives. So our takeaway messages from this study are that currently eye examinations for autistic adults without learning disabilities in the UK are not very accessible. When we're considering accessibility factors, we need to think about the eye examination as a whole, not just what happens in the testing room. Many of these accessibility factors are just to do with good practice, clear communication and good rapport. And some of the findings beg the question as to whether there's a low understanding about autism amongst eye care providers. So what are we doing now? Well, we've been providing thorough eye examinations for autistic adults without learning disabilities at the University of Manchester, into which we've incorporated the findings of our focus groups. So that's into the structure of the eye examination visit, with an aim to make them more autism friendly. But to get further insight and further detail, we've been conducting interviews with the participants during the eye examination to find out what tests they've not liked, what they have liked about the way the tests have been conducted, and what could be improved about the tests to improve their comfort levels. For this, we've had 24 participants, of which 9 were female at birth, and the age range was 19 to 67 years. We're still in the process of completing the analysis, but our preliminary findings are that autistic adults enjoy the process of an eye examination because of the flow, the structure, the different tests, and the different equipment involved. But tests involving bright lights can spark sensory experiences, and those requiring close proximity can cause anxiety. So these aren't very desirable. It's important to tell the patient before you do the test what test is next, what equipment's going to be used, why the test is being conducted, and what they exactly need to do. And this can be really useful for those uncomfortable tests which can cause sensory issues or anxiety issues, because they can prepare the patient for what's going to come, although you're not able to remove that stress-causing factor. Finally, it's really important for the practitioner to be patient with the patient and to avoid rushing the examination. And that could mean spreading the eye examination over 2 visits. What are our next steps? Well, we're going to complete the analysis of the interview recordings, and our overall aim is to actually put together some guidelines for eye care providers based on the focus groups, the interviews, and what we already know, giving them some tips, hints on what to consider when seeing autistic patients, and therefore provide a more autism-friendly service. Now, we're not saying that one size fits all, but it's just to get those thoughts flowing in the minds of eye care providers about what to be aware of. Our ultimate goal would be to set up some training sessions for eye care providers with a similar motive to the guidelines. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening today. I'd like to thank my supervisors, Dr. Emma Gowan, Professor Christine Dickinson, Dr. Catherine Porter, for looking after me in this PhD journey. And if anybody has any queries, questions, thoughts, please don't hesitate to email me. We do also have a study website where you can find out more about the background of the project, what we've been doing, and what we're looking to do in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Ketan. That was really interesting. Very specific, very interesting. Next up, we have Wei Song, and we will be talking about how autistic adults participate in their communities and how we can facilitate that. Yeah, there you are.
Hi, can you all hear me well?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. My name is Wei, and today I would like to talk about the community participation among autistic adults. or conducting a series of cross-sectional studies, working with researchers at Temple University and Drexel University in Philadelphia, United States. So, forgot to share my screen. I shared two slides, sorry about that. So we really want to understand community participation because it helps us to create an inclusive environment for all autistic individuals. And we know that people want to participate and that there are ways to help them to promote participation in terms of including the employment and education. And we have a lot of evidence showing that participation is really good for one's health and the quality of life. So when we talk about community participation, we really mean the different domains of in one's life, either from work, go to school, or dating, or you enjoy yourself, like going to a movie or getting together with family, friends, or engage in civic activities, whatever is important for that individual. And our work is mainly based on this SAF framework and thinking that participation as a main domain of a health outcome, and also trying to figure out what are some of the important personal and environmental factors that could help people to get out in their community. So in today's presentation, I will briefly introduce our measure and our sample, and then I'll start with talking about the overall participation of autistic adults by comparing it to adults in the general population. And then I'll focus on two environmental factors, which is living arrangement and transportation use. And then I'll introduce some of the factors that potentially correlates with community participation. And I'll end the presentation with some implications and future direction. So to measure community participation, we use the measure called Temple University Community Participation Measure. And you can see this is the structure of the measure. We have a total of 24 activities. And for each activity, we ask them the number of days they participated in the last 30 days. And then we ask them whether they consider they do this activity enough or not enough. So this is more about their perceived sufficiency of how much they're doing in this activity. And then the last question is mainly capture the individual preferences and interests by asking them whether they consider this activity important or not. So based on all those three questions, we generated three main outcomes of interest. The first one is the amount of participation, which is the total number of days across all 24 activities. We also would like to know the breadth of participation. This really captures the diversity of people participated in the community, and we really care about the important areas. And the third outcome is the sufficiency of participation, really talks about whether people think they do enough in the areas that are important to them. And this kind of indicate whether they're satisfied with the amount of participation. So using those three outcomes, this is our sample. I'll just give you an overview of our sample. Looks like all autistic adults in our sample were recruited in Pennsylvania, United States. And I would like to point out that here, in terms of age, we do have a very good range of age, but the majority of our autistic adults were less than 30 years old. So it's still a very young sample. And here I want to present is how comparing to general population and how autistic adults are doing. And you can see that in terms of participation days, that autistic adults participated much less than the adults in the general population. And in terms of the breadth, and you can also see that the autistic adults participated in a much less varied activities than the adults in the general population. And also in terms of sufficiency, you can see that autistic adults may desire a higher amount of participation compared to the adults in the general population. So overall, we can see the autistic adults in all different aspects of participation, they participated lower. Since we know that they participated in less frequently, we may wonder in what area, right? I don't have enough time to elaborate on in the slide, so I'm just going to briefly highlight some of the main areas that they reported less than the adults in the general population. And I also want to point out that the autistic adults reported more frequently using public transit, which is interesting but not surprising, because we know that not a lot of them have access to a car or have a driver license. So probably public transit is the main mode for them to get to important appointments. And also autistic adults reported a little more frequently to go to school, but this is mainly because we have a much younger sample. So next I will just focus on the environmental factors, and the first environmental factors I'm going to introduce is living arrangement. And here is the distribution of different living conditions. So you can see the majority of them living with family. And in terms of community participation across different living situations, the chart is a little complicated, but I want to point it out a few things. First thing, the column represents participation days. And here, if you focus on the supported living facilities, you can see the people who live in this situation have a relatively lower participation days. Also, the yellow line represents the rest, means they have a very low diversity of participation. However, they reported a very high sufficiency. So this indicates that even though they participated not as much as people in the other situation, but they are very satisfied with their participation level. And I also would like to point it out another group is alone without support. And here you can see that they have relatively lower participation days and comparable breadth of participation, but they also reported a very low satisfaction with their amount of participation. This is saying that the people who live in support, who living alone with support, probably would require more services and the support to help them to participate as much as they want to. And then the next one I want to talk about is transportation use. And here is some prevalence of transportation modes. And you can also see that the majority of the autistic people take rides. And it's really interesting when we talk about what we want to compare in terms of transportation use. The first thing we would like to know is between the drivers and non-drivers and how things would be different, right? So we did find like a small, well, it's moderate differences in terms of frequency of participation, and the drivers did show a higher diversity of participation, and as well as their satisfaction with their amount of participation. And the second comparison we really want to know is public transit, right? So, and for this comparison, we focus on the non-drivers because we think public transportation is more important for the people who actually cannot drive, who don't have access to a car. And among the non-drivers, you can see the public transit users still have slightly higher participation days and more diverse participation, but their sufficiency ratio is very similar. So public transit for non-drivers probably won't help them to participate as much as they want, or at least didn't improve it. And the last comparison we did is comparing the people who take rides and use service transportation versus those who have access to independent transportation. And the independent transportation is focused on mainly includes the people who drive, took public transit, who walk and back. And this comparison also show a big boost in terms of participation days, as well as the you can see the diversity of participation also higher for the people who have access to independent transportation. But the sufficiency is also is very similar between the two groups. So this is saying that independent transportation probably is not enough for them to participate as much as they would like to. Next, I would like to introduce some of the personal factors. First is age. We didn't find any relationship between age and community participation, but as a reminder that our sample is relatively young, so probably we don't have enough power to find age differences because we don't have a lot of people, middle-aged and older people in our sample. When we did examine the gender differences, although women and men have a similar amount of participation, but women did participate to a limited range of activities compared to men. And we found some sort of post-secondary education is associated with higher amount and a broader range of participation and income. Here we focus on the low income. The people who have low income have lower satisfaction with their participation level. And we also have a couple of clinical factors. The first is intellectual disabilities. And for those people, they have lower amount and breadth of participation. However, they do have a very high satisfaction compared to the people who without intellectual disability. And the last one is the mental health diagnosis. The autistic people who have a co-occurring mental health diagnosis, they report a lower satisfaction with how much they participated. So I know that I'm probably running out of time. I just want to share some of the implications. Our series of a study is really trying to understand different domains of one's life and where in terms of the location of the participation as well as the individual preferences, and also trying to understand and addressing some of the environmental barriers, and hopefully that community can use whatever available resources that could help everyone to be included in the community. And the third, there are some support technologies, especially natural support from family, when we're considering a lot of autistic adults actually still live with families. So using those support technologies could help them to get out in the community. Also really to think about what accommodations that we can apply in different areas instead of seeking like one fit all policy. And some of the future directions is we have a couple of other environmental factors we would like to look at, such as the social rules of whether people are parents or not. And we know this is a very small population in the autism sample, but it still could have impact on their community participation. And another thing is whether they have access to community-based services. And a generalizability is more about kind of our limitation of the study, because we don't have, we didn't include the people who couldn't self-report. So we're wondering what are some the community participation experiences for them, and how do we want to measure community participation for them as well, and how should we really measure participation across cultures, since our measure is kind of very US based, but not everyone is doing the same activities everywhere else. So, and the last one is really focused on more about middle-aged and older adults. And that's the end of my presentation. I really thanks for all the collaborators and founders, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions. I'm sorry that I'm giving a lot of information and I'm probably not explaining all of them very well. So if you have any questions or interested in talking about this topic more, yeah, feel free to reach out. I'll be love to talk them with you. Thank you so much. That'll be all from me.
Thank you so much, Wei. Before you leave, can I just clarify a question that came up? So you talked about rides in your talk and as the US term. Do you mean given a lift or as a passenger in the UK? Is that the equivalent?
It's more rides provided by family and friends. Staff is like non-paid volunteering kind of rides. Ride sharing is another transportation. We consider ride sharing as another transportation mode.
Thank you. A little sneak peek of our Q&A in a second, but I just wanted to get that in before we moved on. So our last speaker for the session, and definitely not the least, that's not quite what I meant to say, but it works. Last speaker on the festival as well is Jill. And Jill Bradshaw is going to be talking about assessing the sensory needs of autistic adults. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Beth, and thank you very much, everybody. It's a hot Friday afternoon. Last speaker. I hope you're all right. Please do stick with me. I'm delighted to be here at this Autistica conference to talk to you about some of our work that we've been doing assessing the sensory needs of autistic adults. This work was conducted at the Pritchard Centre at the University of Kent, and the research team consisted of Jane Pringle, Damien Milton, who I'm sure needs no introduction at all, and also Professor Julie Fiedler-Brown. We were very fortunate to get funding for this research from the John and Lorna Wing Foundation. So why were we interested in the sensory needs of autistic adults? Well, we know that sensory perceptual differences are reported to be experienced by many autistic adults, so between 45 and 95% of people who are diagnosed as autistic. We were interested in looking at the sensory assessments that were commonly being used, and there was a systematic review of those in 2017, and Burns et al. Reported that the most commonly used sensory assessment was Dunn's sensory profile. However, all of the assessments that they found in their review relied on informant reports rather than on behavioural observations. And we were interested in whether or not existing assessments had been devised specifically for autistic people, because of course many people experience sensory perceptual differences. And we were also interested in, does having information about people's sensory needs result in changes being made in people's environments? So our initial aims were to find out more information about the sensory experiences of autistic adults who had intellectual disabilities, and from there to look at whether or not identified needs resulted in adaptations being made to the environment. And so we had planned to do some assessments of sensory needs, to carry out some interviews, including adapted interviews, so that we could talk to both staff and also autistic adults who had intellectual disabilities. We wanted to observe the features of the environment, and we had also planned an intervention, and we wanted to know whether our intervention might result in changes, and whether, if there were changes, they had any impact in terms of people's quality of life. And then COVID-19 happened. COVID-19 had a huge impact on all of our lives, but very particularly on the lives of adults being supported in social care settings. And so it was very clear quite quickly that we couldn't continue our research as we had initially planned to. So what I'm going to talk to you about in the next few minutes is what we ended up doing instead. We used a survey to find out about people's sensory needs, and we had already done quite a bit of work looking at all of the different types of sensory assessments. We needed something that was freely available and quick to do, and so we used the Autism Education Trust's sensory checklist, and we adapted it slightly in terms of the language. And that autism assessment checklist is based on the work of Bogdashina. Prior to COVID, we'd already spent some time in services looking at the sensory environments. And so from our observations, we developed a sensory environment checklist as well, and we distributed that online. We had a version for informants for autistic adults who had intellectual disabilities. And then later, we also added a self-report option for autistic adults. For those of you who are not familiar with the AET checklist, there are a number of different items, and you respond yes, no, or don't know. And examples are resist change to routine, prefers to sit at the back or front of a group, covers ears when hears certain sounds, can hear sounds that others do not hear. So we had nearly 200 responses to our survey, which we were really pleased about. And that included 138 autistic adults who self-reported, and 58 family carers or paid support staff who reported about autistic adults who had intellectual disabilities. The autistic adults reported higher levels of sensory needs in comparison to the responses from informants. So people who self-reported tended to report more sensory needs. If a member of staff or a family member was reporting about somebody who had intellectual disabilities and who were autistic, they tended to report fewer. So for autistic adults who self-reported, the mean number of sensory issues that they identified was 21. And for autistic adults who had somebody an informant reporting on their behalf, the mean number was 17. That general trend of autistic adults reporting higher levels of sensory needs was reversed on 4 items. 2 of those items related to sensory seeking behaviours, so bangs, objects and doors, or is attracted to sounds and noise. 1 related to awareness of temperature, and the final one related to dislike of crunchy foods. We were not sure why that would be the case, that generally autistic adults would report higher levels of sensory needs than was the case for informants who were reporting sensory needs for an autistic adult who had an intellectual disability. But one thing to note is that the proxy reports, so the reports that staff or paid support staff or family carers gave us about somebody with an intellectual disability, contained many more don't know responses. And so we wonder whether that might be something that's of interest. We wanted to know what the environment was like, and so we also created a checklist of the sensory environment. And the sorts of examples that we had on there were which statement best describes the environment. Option 1, there's a high degree of predictability across days and weeks. What is happening is clearly communicated, and there's a mechanism in place to communicate any changes. Another option is there are some methods in place to indicate what's happening, but there's little consistency in routine. or people could select. There's no rhythm to the day and nothing in place to communicate what or when things are happening. And there was always a response of don't know or not sure or not applicable. And we were then looking to see whether or not there were matches. So when a sensory need was identified, either by an informant or by self-report, to what extent did that appear to match with an environment that somebody spent time in? And we asked people to select and report about one environment where they spent time in. So taking, for example, resist change to routine, if you had selected you were in an environment where there was a high degree of predictability that was clearly communicated, we coded that as a full match. If you said there was little consistency and only some methods to communicate, that would be a partial match. If the report was there was no rhythm and no mechanism to communicate, that would be no match. Informants reported more matches than did autistic adults who self-reported. And so lots of needs were not met, but according to the information we got, if you were an autistic adult who was living in adult social care and you had an intellectual disability, you were more likely to get your sensory needs recognised. There is a caveat, of course, in that many people who lived in those settings had needs that were not known about. When we looked at people who self-reported, they were less likely to report needs having been met in a work environment. And interestingly, in both samples, so both the autistic adults and the autistic adults who had intellectual disabilities, support was sometimes described as being in place despite that need not having been identified. And of course, that's not a problem in that environment, but if the need isn't identified, it might be that that need isn't being met in other environments. So there are many, many caveats that I want to kind of caution in terms of interpreting our findings. We had fewer autistic participants who had intellectual disabilities in our sample. We are not able to say whether or not our data accurately reflects practice. We don't have any independent checks of the environments. There's no space in the questionnaire for qualitative exploration. We needed to make the questionnaire as quick and as easy as possible for people to fill out. And so I can't tell you anything about why people responded as they did. Our research was conducted during COVID, and so of course there were many environmental changes that were likely just because of COVID. However, it doesn't seem to make sense to us that autistic adults who have intellectual disabilities would have fewer sensory issues than autistic adults who don't have intellectual disabilities. And we can see that some sensory issues are harder to observe. And if you're an autistic adult who has intellectual disabilities, you are likely to find some things quite difficult to communicate about. And so that's a problem. Also, we think that there might be some underreporting of sensory issues for autistic adults who don't have intellectual disabilities. Autistic adults without intellectual disabilities might not display particular sensory seeking behaviour for fear of social sanction and stigma. So we didn't set out to develop a questionnaire, and we certainly didn't set out to do something that was going to be delivered online. But I think we found some interesting initial findings, and it's an area where we'd certainly like some opportunities to do some more research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Jill. We're going to move on to Q&A. I'll ask Q&A of the festival. So if you've got any questions you haven't had a chance to submit yet, please do. And if Wei and Ketan can join us. Brilliant, thank you guys. So my first question, Jill, you've got the top corner of honour, I guess, is what led you to kind of study this, this research?
So it came out of conversations that Damien Milton and I had. Damien is a colleague of mine at the Pritchard Centre, and we were particularly interested in sensory experiences and autistic adults with intellectual disabilities, because we recognised that was an area that was not studied very well. I'm a speech and language therapist by background, and so I'm always very interested in what about people who are unable to tell you about their experiences directly, and how might we be best able to capture that information. And I might have been able to come and tell you about some of those ways had it not been for COVID, because clearly that element of our research was unable to go ahead.
Right, thank you. Ketan, what about you?
So, as I said, I'm an optometrist by profession, and I really wanted to seek the unique avenues in my career. And when I practice, I really enjoy fulfilling that part of patient care and communication and providing a meaningful service. Because you can have all the clinical skills you want, but if that communication and that patient care isn't nailed, then there's going to be a big break in the service. What attracted me to the project was the practicality of the project and the implications, the positive implications it can have when we finish the study and when we've put out our resources, and that it will instantly provide extra support, help for optometrists as well as autistic adults. Yeah.
Thank you. Wei, what about you?
Yeah, I'm educational psychology by training. I worked at a research center for people with intellectual disabilities, and they focus on community inclusion. And that was my opportunity to get into the disability research. But at that time, people talk about IDDD as a general population. And I found that autistic people obviously have a very different challenges of getting included in the communities. And then later I got an opportunity to work with Mark Souther, who is a professor at the Temple University, and really look at the community participation for autism population from a public health perspective. And that's what we've been doing since then. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Jill, I'll start with a question for you, and this is quite a big question, I think. So based on the variability between those self-reporting and those reporting on behalf of someone else, did it make you kind of question the authenticity of secondhand reporting and research? And do you have any thoughts about how we can actually make those types of reports, either get them directly from autistic people with lower communication ability, or just make them better generally?
Yeah, so I need to be clear that we were not getting self-report and informant reports from the same people. That's a slightly different question, I guess. But yes, it did. In answer to your question, yes, it did make us really think about the quality of information that's coming from informant reports. And we did have some different ways that we were going to use to try and access people's views directly. And so using photos, using talking maps, so using an adapted framework. And so that might have been one way. I think the other thing that we had been thinking about is whether autistic people who don't have intellectual disabilities might be helpful in terms of coming and looking at environments and noticing the things that are happening in terms of sensory issues, and whether or not that might be something that would be interesting to explore going forward. There was some suggestion that autistic adults were rather better at identifying sensory issues. So I don't think it's an easy question to answer, but definitely we need to do whatever we can to try and access views directly from people who have complex communication challenges, and to always think about sensory issues as being a possible factor and trying to notice as much as we possibly can.
Great, thank you. That's a good answer to a big question, I think. Ketan, one for you. So it's kind of asking where you could go next with this research. Someone's asked if you thought about looking at actual process of choosing glasses or eye care, or if you thought about kind of whether it could branch out beyond optometry. That wasn't any better. Where do you see this going next?
So the first question, so the guidelines that we want to put together, we want to make sure that they consider the eye examination visit as a whole. So from even before the patient comes for the visit up until selection of glasses and all of that, because like I said in the presentation, most of the guidance that's available is just to do with the testing room itself, but nothing outside that. So we want to try and better that by providing that information and balancing things out. The second question about application to other healthcare settings. So there has been some research which is more applicable to like dental settings or hospital settings or GP practices, I'm pretty sure. So although there's quite a few overlapping factors, like about waiting rooms, sensory experiences, communication. There's the reason why we honed in just on optometric services is because there's those one or two, well, not one or two, but quite a few unique aspects of an optometric practice which you wouldn't get in a dental environment or a hospital setting. So I hope that answers that.
It does. Thank you very much. And for you, Wei, I guess similar question, but if you were to take this research forward, to kind of reproduce it or expand it, would you kind of look to include measures to include groups that you weren't able to include this time and bring their voices into the research?
We don't have a lot of measures for community participation for autistic adults. Especially there's not a lot of validated measures. I'm sure there's researchers been doing, creating their measures to do different things. So it's kind of difficult to ask the questions we're asking in our measures to everyone, because we kind of want their own preferences and their own perceptions. So there hasn't been a very good solution to ask the people who wouldn't be able to to self-report and self-report our measure. In order to include the people, if we want to include people who cannot self-report, then we probably have to go through another route, like doing. Instead of asking satisfaction questions, we could just ask their caregiver staff to report simply objective measures of participation, like frequency of participation, which probably lost some meanings in our measure as well. And there are also middle-aged and older adults that we would like to include more in the future study, and that's definitely some efforts that we would like to put in, focus on recruiting people in that age range in order to have better understanding of age-related differences.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Definitely. Jill, sorry, carry on with. Brilliant. Jill, another one for you, and this kind of overlaps slightly with the last one, definitely looking at that difference between the two reports or the two groups. And they want to know kind of, is a possible reason for that difference between self-report and observer report that autistic people may be able to experience sensory distress, but not actually able to initiate the action to avoid it and kind of take themselves away from it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I think that our assumption is that many autistic adults who had intellectual disabilities had many sensory needs that were not recognised. And why were they not recognised? Well, probably because either they were impossible to avoid, or as your questioner suggests, they were distressed and unable to move away from the source that was causing that distress. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that would be something that would be really interesting to explore in more detail.
Thank you. Ketan, so this person says, yeah, obviously it's great to hear about how proactive kind of your group and your research has been at meeting your needs for the autistic population. They're wondering about access to testing and management of conditions that might be more common in autistic people. So they give the example of vertical heterophoria, which visual stress, all the big words in the session today. Are these tests common? How can, or do they tend to be limited outside normal kind of sessions? Does that make sense as a question?
Yes. So the overall title of my PhD is investigating optometric and orthoptic conditions in autistic adults. So optometric is like glasses, orthoptic is to do with the balance of the eye muscles, so squints, lazy eyes, double vision, things like that. So when we were doing the eye examinations, we were conducting thorough eye examinations, doing a multitude of tests, which all optometrists can do. And that included checking the balance of the eye muscles, checking for sensitivity to patterns, which is visual stress. And as part of that study, we are going to characterize the visual conditions which came up in our participants, in our autistic adults without learning disabilities, in the eye examinations. So the eye examinations was kind of like a 2-in-1, where we did interviews to find out what could be improved, as well as all the tests to find out, to try and characterize the visual conditions there. So we, again, in our guidance, we will give some tips and guidelines as to how testing could be bettered. Like in our this interview study, which we're analysing at the moment, we will be pointing out some tests that our participants didn't really like, and some possible suggestions of how they could be substituted for something else, etc. That's what we're looking into. Visual stress wise, yes, optometrists can check for visual stress using something called a pattern glare test. But it's important for me to say that many of the symptoms of visual stress, so that's sensitivity to patterns, do overlap with other things like not having an up-to-date prescription or difficulty with the coordination of the eyes. So what we've been doing in our eye examinations is really breaking things down. So if we found at our eye examination visit that the patient had visual stress, but also had a change in prescription, and also had something wrong with the balance of the eye muscles, we firstly gave them a new pair of glasses and see how things changed with that. We then, when we followed them up, we dealt with any eye muscle balance issues existing, or if they were still there, and then we dealt with that. And only after those two things did we think about any treatment for visual stress, which is like the coloured and tinted glasses that you can get. I hope that's okay. Sorry, it was a long answer.
No, definitely interesting. It's very very specific, very interesting area that we haven't heard much about before, especially at this conference. Thank you for sharing. And Wei, I'll finish off this part of the session with the last question for you. So obviously your talk is about kind of participating in communities, facilitating that participation. Obviously over the last 18 months, this has changed a lot. Whether this is kind of your own research or other research that you know of, have you kind of come across research that looks at kind of participation in community, but also reflects kind of increased isolation potentially that comes from COVID for autistic people? Or has that not been your finding, that isolation not being your findings in terms of research?
We were conducting a study focusing on leisure participation during the COVID. So we use something called ecological momentary assessment and ask people to report their leisure participation every day for 30 days. That data was collected during August, from last September to this May. And it's really hard to tell whether this is COVID impact because there's no pre-COVID data, but we did find that the majority of people stayed at home and doing solitary activities by themselves. And we did collect their level of distress and anxiety level, but unfortunately, we haven't analyzed the data to that point. So that will be something that we'll look at and to see the community leader participation across 30 days, and that would associate with their levels of anxiety. So yeah, that's some ongoing work, and unfortunately, that I couldn't tell much more than that.
No, that's absolutely fine. I look forward to seeing more of that to come. Thank you so much, you three, Jill, Ketan and Wei, for joining us this afternoon. It's all going. It was probably a good time to finish, definitely. Thank you for sharing your talks and for finishing off our festival for us.